Here is something you might not know. SAGA Wisdom provides extra value to our subscribers by attending industry's most popular conferences and workshops and reviewing our favorite talks and papers from each of these in our news section. To give you a sense of what these look like, we have pulled 20 minutes of our recent hour-long URTeC 2022 conference review for you to see. All SAGA Wisdom subscribers have unlimited access to these reviews, as well as links to papers discussed in our context-sensitive interactive transcription. And now I will stop talking and turn it over to SAGA Wisdom President John Thompson.
Now transitioning over into particular paper presentations that we liked. Of course, we're both reservoir engineers, and the focus that we're going to have is going to have that lens on as we're attracted to certain types of papers. And so let's talk about some of the things that stood out to us. We've got a handful plus of papers to review. One of the ones that I attended that I liked was from Occidental. And we had a few people from Oxy and one person that was formerly with Oxy. And these authors are Stephanie Lim, Vivek, Muralidharan, Soodabeh, Esmaili, and Spencer McKone. They wrote a paper called Improving Analytical Flowing Material Balance Workflow Considering Formation Water Production. And that's URTeC 3722261. What I liked about this one is, of course, a lot of people are doing flowing material balance analysis to figure out the calculated volume, the stimulated reservoir volume, and people either use multi-phase flow techniques, right, as featured in some commercial software packages, or what they're proposing in this one is, you know what, we can stick to single-phase oil FMB. And I'm like, really? That's a surprise. How are you doing that with three phases, water, gas, oil? That's going to cause massive changes in compressibility and other things. But they've got a bit of a rule of thumb that they've created by establishing a new adjustment factor. And they said, if I do FMB of oil and I look at it, I get a really small SRV volume, way smaller than what it actually is in real life. And they know that because they did a bunch of numerical simulation with known reservoir descriptions and volumes. They had the answer key. They analyzed it in their RTA tool and they said, oh, this SRV is a fraction of what we built. So there's a bust. So they created this factor, which is 1 plus water to oil ratio divided by formation volume factor of oil initial. And with that fudge factor, that adjustment factor, they compared it to multi-phase FMB results along with their known answer key from simulation. And the correlation was, well, we're going to show it here up above. And it's remarkable. It's like a quick and dirty tool where you can use a single phase technique and arrive at a multi-phase, like a really rigorous multi-phase flow approach to FMB. So for something that's practical, that's their argument. We've done something practical. Now, of course, if I've got those fancy commercial packages and we know where those are featured, that does it pretty efficiently and automatically. So maybe you don't need this approach. But for those other people that are making their own Excel spreadsheets and taking a single phase approach, and that's maybe a lot of people who don't want to dish out for the expensive commercial tools, this is a nice little trick that makes it work. So, and I'm always in favor of things like that. So that was its contribution to the literature, and my hat's off to the team over at Oxy. To the next paper that I liked. We're going to get into the team of Whitson. So this one was presented by Mathias Carlsen and co-authored with the man himself, Curtis Hayes Whitson. And this is part one of a two-part paper series. Who knows, maybe it goes to part 3, 4, 5. But the first part was numerical RTA extended to complex fracture systems. And the latest works of Whitson usually start with acknowledging the contributions of Braden Bowie and James Ewart, who first published the numerical RTA workflow back in 2020. And that solves the inherent problem associated with complex superposition of multi-phase flow effects involving time and spatial changes in pressure compositions and PVT property saturations and complex phase mobilities. So they did a great job. And what Whitson's been doing lately is taking the foundation of that work and they just keep adding to it and adding to it. The year after that came out, Carlsen et al., Mathias et al., they extended the workflow to account for all fluid systems, not just oil, which is Braden Bowie and Ewart put in their paper, works for finite conductivity fractures, low FCDs, not everything infinite, and uses the concept of cumulative linear flow parameters to reduce noise. So they've already tackled that. So what is this one going to possibly bring us from this paper? Well, welcome to the Jorge Acuna parameter and the delta. And delta being a term that sort of bulk represents non-uniform fractures or heterogeneities, fracture swarms, complex fractures, things that really, if I want to put it in simple terms to the reservoir community, the muddy long transition that exists between linear flow and boundary dominated flow. And that ugly transition in between can be created by non-uniform fracture geometries, as observed in swarms. Of course, multi-phase flow effects can contribute to that. Geomechanical effects or compaction effects can contribute to that. But really what this paper is really focused on is geometry and that delta value. And for those of you who don't know the Acuna stuff, I think I'll jump into it a little bit just so you're familiar with it. The equations that he's arrived at, there's a few key things that Jorge Acuna, who was formerly with Chevron, now he's got his own consulting practice, he's focused on looking at those power law relationships on the well performance profile, which we'll call transition between flow regimes, and say, okay, I can characterize that with a single value called delta. If it's a delta of 0.5, it's pure linear transient linear flow. It's like a straight line on a square root time plot. If it's a delta of 0, it hooks up, it's boundary dominated flow, and everything else in between is some degree of transition. And if it's close to 0, there's a lot of frac to frac boundary effects going on with a little bit of transient left. And if it's closer to 0.5, it's mostly infinite acting transient. But maybe if it's a 0.4, there's some fractures that are touching and there's little boundary effects. So that's the conceptual model. So why is this a nice method? Well, like B values, what I like about it, its elegance, in my opinion, is that I can talk to my neighboring RE and say that's a delta of 0.2. That means we've got a lot of frac complexity going on versus a delta of 0.4. And that's, primarily transient linear. And if I'm trying to create complexity with my completion design, with fracture intensity and clusters that are close together, I'm chasing that lower delta because that lower delta may result in a better EUR, more frac area near the wellbore. So that's its practical purpose. And what a beautiful language that you can use to communicate an idea from one RE to another or to the reserves team. So I'm really a big fan of that. In fact, we're going to see in a later paper co-authored by Alejandro Lerza, who's with Chevron and some folks at YPF in Argentina, that they've taken that approach and they've talked about different deltas with different completion designs, and more on that later. But essentially what Mathias's work and Whitson's work was tell you what, we're going to do this with a simulator. We're going to take a whole bunch of different designs and we're going to, where we have known answer keys, and we're going to prove that I guess that we got the same delta, that heterogeneity, fracture heterogeneity term, with the same LFP and OIP, if they're all the same, that we can prove that all the well performance signatures are going to be identical, meaning same rates, cumes, GOR, water cuts, independent of time and flow regime. And they were able to successfully demonstrate that, through simulation-based exercises. In the second part of the paper that I'm not covering, he was able to demonstrate that with real field examples and taking that workflow and that approach on real wells. The only thing that I think he hasn't addressed but could easily incorporate as well is something else that would contribute to that observed signature that may not be about the delta, and that could be compaction effects. Stress-sensitive reservoirs that might have one of those Yilmaz and Noor gamma values that is the exponential relationship of permeability to pressure, where if we do high drawdown strategies, we may see something that looks like boundary-dominated flow, or chokeback strategies where those stress-sensitive formations look more transient, where we can control the signature of the well based on how we draw on the well. That isn't touched on in this paper or even in that Vaca Muerta study. So that might be the next logical place to take the research. But as always, this Whitson paper was perfectly articulated and presented. So moving on, no big surprise, let's move on to that Vaca Muerta case study I'd referenced earlier. That's URTeC 3726020, well completion performance analysis in the Vaca Muerta by leveraging fractional dimension RTA case study, FDRTA. Again, this is the Acuna fractal RTA approach. Of course, Acuna used to work for Chevron, so it would make sense that it's properly featured here. It has been historically challenging to determine the economic advantage of choosing one completion design over another, just based on the fact that there's no direct consistent output of I frack this way and I get this production output. There's kind of a probabilistic range for these sorts of things. So this paper features a statistical look at things, but they also introduce, we'll call it modern RTA or FDRTA, which really is that parameter that describes the transitional flow regime as captured by the Acuna parameter, or that delta. And once again, if the delta is high, it's more transient linear looking. And if the delta is low, its fractures are closer together. And that could be a proxy for fracture complexity, which generally gives better production in EUR. So there was 168 Vaca Muerta wells that were evaluated, and they were totally binned. They were grouped by area, bench, completion design. The wells were all subjected to a fairly consistent drawdown strategy, though. That's pretty important to note. So if there's stress effects in the Vaca Muerta, which I believe there are a lot of, you're dealing with pore pressure gradients in the 0.9 psi per foot range. Things like that are well performance is sensitive to drawdown strategies. So the good news in this study is they were all pretty much the same. It wasn't like one was really choked back and one was wide open, and that's going to really help in the comparative analysis of all these wells. But that's for another story to talk about. What he was essentially saying, and I'm going to try to capture some words from the paper, the lower decline rate of equally spaced fracture models creates an overestimation of long-term flow rates, which becomes a reason to include compaction effects to reduce productivity at late times. FDRTA, on the other hand, creates different models that match both early and late time production without the use of enhanced permeability regions, we've heard of these EFR models, or compaction effects. Now, that may be true as long as the drawdown strategies are the same for all the wells. I would challenge and say if there's a high IP rate program versus low, compaction will have an absolute impact on the delta, and you could misinterpret something that's compaction driven versus something that's fracture geometry driven. But again, that's for another study. The completion design groups that Alejandro and team looked at had three different, we'll say, general completion designs, groups A, B, and C. A was a median proppant intensity load with a wide range of fluid per cluster values. Group B was a reduction in proppant intensity with lower end fluid per cluster values. And group C was high proppant intensity with reduced fluid per cluster. And they tried those three different completion designs in three totally different landing zones. So one was like, they refer to zones 1, 2, and 3. And there's a figure that he produces in the paper, which we can show here, that shows that in the upper zone 1, when they did this FDRTA, they could see that the delta value was abnormally low, and it had amazing long-term production results, EUR results. And that was, big surprise, lower delta, faster transition to BDF, or faster transition to frac communication. And they were able to successfully use that modern RTA approach to discover an optimal completion design, and it stands out quite easily in that particular zone. In the other zones, I'd say it's not as conclusive, but still, what a worthwhile approach and methodology for very quickly understanding the impact of different completion designs at different zones of interest. And the main point with this paper is the statistical EUR analyses showed completion design group C, that one with all the completion intensity, as the one yielding the highest average EURs. And there was a part in the paper, of course, that accounted for some of the economics. There's a ratio that they look at to make sure not only is it the best EUR, it's the best EUR for the dollar. So that's also, I think, lightly covered in the paper. The final paper I want to talk about, which had a little drama in it, was URTeC 3725840. And this is on the relationship between gas to oil ratio, GOR, and well performance for unconventional reservoirs. And this has got the heavy hitters. This is David Fulford from Arm Energy, Hamid Bemenesh for Canada, Carbon Management Canada, Chris Clarkson from the University of Calgary, and Tom Blassingame. I don't think he needs any introduction, from A&M. And the objective of their work was to study the various factors which control producing GOR trends and then relate these factors to well performance using field examples and realistic reservoir simulation cases. This was an excellent piece of work. I was able to look at the manuscript a little bit more in depth last night. I did attend the paper presentation as delivered by Carlsen, and it was very well put together with a very strong lit review. So I encourage anybody who's looking at GOR-based papers to go to this paper because it references the Stephen Joneses of the world and the other technical authorities that have contributed over the last few years to understanding the influence of GOR on well performance and reserves. So the way this paper works is semi-synthetic simulation cases were generated. What does that mean? It means you use actual flowing, bottom hole flowing pressure profiles from real field cases, but then you use simulators to simulate what the 3 rates off the wellhead would be doing. So it is derived from field data on the PWF profile in that case. And they were generated for a range of fracture and reservoir geometries. So they considered different fracture geometries and reservoir boundaries and all that sort of thing, including variable fracture spacing, like non-uniform fracture spacing. And they wanted to see like what could be learned from playing with geometries on producing GOR. So the semi-synthetic cases studied exhibited an adequate range in the GOR profiles that are affected by these geometries. And in those cases, they can be related to differences in flow regimes, sequences, and timing. So going from transient linear flow to transition to a BDF, is that going to have a consequence on GOR? Absolutely. What's the one that's going to have the biggest impact? BDF, tank-like depletion. Same thing that we know about conventional reservoirs. And the ones where you see in the Permian, those GORs take off like a rocket, the first thing you're looking for is look left, look right. Am I bounded? Am I an infill well? Do I have a huge completion design? Have I as an operator put this well in a scenario where I've transitioned it into BDF hard quickly? Chances are yes. And looking at public production data, those profiles where BDF really takes over the GOR are those situations in my observations. It's not just child wells, it's those infills that are nestled between parents with big frac programs. And we are starting to see that. So that profile and many others were covered in the paper. The primary difference between high perm conventional reservoirs and tight reservoirs is that for the former, the GOR is controlled primarily by the average reservoir pressure. So that's your conventional side. But for the latter, GOR is strongly controlled by flowing pressure, particularly during transient and transitional flow, which dominates a lot of the production history for unconventionals. And hopefully that's not news to those of you that are following along. A suite of Avalon and First Bone Spring multi-fract horizontals were looked at, representing a really wide range of GOR profiles, which was helpful because we're trying to figure out what makes each tick. Comparisons with the semi-synthetic and simulation results allowed for the rationalization of the relationship between the GOR trends and the performance differences. Additional field cases were looked at. It wasn't all about the Bone Spring. We had the Wolfcamp, the Montney, and the Eagleford. A little more popular of those, those are the big plays, particularly the biggest in Canada through the Montney. And they also showed working examples in the paper. So they did do a good job kind of covering a lot of different basins and formations. One of the comment I want to make, like one of the grand conclusions here, is that plotting EUR against GOR for the 6 Avalon wells demonstrated that one, there was no clear correlation between EUR and GOR, which is interesting. And 2, that the variability in EUR for all 6 wells was less than 30% despite a wide range in GOR trends. So there's a little part where they're not just talking about the well performance profiles with different geometries. They're actually weighing in on EUR and reserves and saying, listen, is there an impact? We're going to get higher GORs with lower oil production for EUR? Yes, slightly, but we're talking about, in this particular formation, we're not talking Eagleford, Marcellus, Montney. This is the Avalon, so let's be clear about that. But the variability in the EUR was less than 30%, despite a tremendous wide range in GOR. So that's an interesting observation. I'd love to see what those results are for the Eagle Ford and the Permian and the plays that are, where all the rigs are and where there might be some controversy. Maybe that range is a lot bigger.
SAGA Wisdom in Energy.